This is the first lesson of the main strategy section of this course, and in it we're going to explore the fundamental elements of the game, which includes time, space, and force. We will also be looking at three additional very important strategic factors, which are the pawn structure, control of the center of the chessboard, and the initiative. I like to refer to all these strategic elements as the unseen forces, because they are the unobvious background elements that are present throughout the game. And they actually determine what you can and cannot do. That is, you need an advantage in one of these elements in order to justify an attack. Otherwise, your attack can be repelled. At its heart, chess is a game of strategy. It is a thoughtful game in the truest sense of that word. It's important to understand the distinction between reacting to your opponent's last move and responding to it, which implies more thinking. Pausing to understand what is going on generally as well as specifically in the position. Although it's difficult to speak of one element without its effect on the other elements, in this first lesson on strategy we're going to focus on time, because with the first move white has the advantage, a very slight one, but white tends to win more games than black. It's like having the first serve in tennis. The opponent is immediately placed on the defensive. Every move in chess is considered a tempo, which relates to time and timing. When your position is better and you're able to control your opponent with the threat of gaining an advantage, you're said to have the initiative. Having the initiative is often defined as placing your opponent on the defensive, but this is an incomplete understanding because there are many times in chess when the player who actually has the initiative is forced to defend, and for a long time in many circumstances. But with proper defense, he is then finally able to realize his initiative and then place his opponent on the defensive and use that initiative to eventually gain a decisive advantage. When you or your opponent is placed on the defensive in chess, it makes it easier to make a mistake due to the psychological pressure that normally comes when defending. It can also prevent the defender from going on the attack, although looking for a counterattack is often the best way to handle an attack. As I just mentioned, every move impacts time, space, and force. With this first pawn move, white is impacting space by guarding or attacking this center square. He's making a claim on space. He has an advantage in time in that he is one step ahead of his opponent, and he has an advantage in force because he has one man on the playing field before black does. Although this initiative is slight, black has to be careful before he makes any offensive moves. He must first try to gain equality. This is called to equalize in chess, which means black has to catch up or neutralize white's first move advantage. As I mentioned, if black tries to attack before he is neutralized, he could face a decisive counterattack by white. Of course, this is chess played at the highest theoretical level, assumes players of equal ability, and assumes no errors on the part of the players. But if you've played any chess at all, you know that mistakes and bad moves, or blunders as they are called in chess, are very common. In fact, chess is a game of errors, and a mistake by the opponent is the other major and most common justification for going on the attack. What does it mean to go on the attack? There are different kinds of attacks or acts of aggression in chess. The most common is to simply engage the enemy where a trade or capture is possible. For example, after white's first opening move, pawn to e4 in this case, black could immediately challenge the enemy who is now in reach of his sword by his own pawn move. Pawn to f5, for example. This does seem to violate opening principles, but it has been played by masters several times, although it loses most of the time. The other similar move, pawn to d5 for example, which also immediately challenges white's pawn move, actually is played and is still played to this day, and black does much better with this immediate attack. After everything I've just said about unjustified attacks, how is it possible that black tries such premature acts of aggression? They're called gambits in chess, which means you are sacrificing a pawn or some of your force or material in the hopes of gaining an advantage in one of the other elements. This introduces another unseen force called compensation. When a player sacrifices or exchanges one element, like time for space or force, he's hoping that his compensation will be superior to his opponent's. Juggling the elements and looking for unobvious compensations has been a favorite pursuit of top players since the beginning of chess. These gambits are tried on both sides of the board, or with either pawn move. Pawn to d4. Black has tried e5, for example, or c5. Or they might delay it and wait a move or two before they sacrifice a pawn. White can also offer these gambit pawns. For example, let's say black plays pawn to d5. Very common move, second move for white, is to play pawn to c4, which is offering a free pawn, at least temporarily. White is hoping to gain an advantage in developing his pieces, which is a force advantage, in exchange for giving up the pawn temporarily. He's also hoping to gain some space, because if black takes the pawn, white could push immediately here and gain the center squares with his pawns. Now let's look at some examples about what it means to have an advantage in time. Okay, as you can see, I've stripped the board down to its bare essentials. Both sides have a king and one pawn. But unfortunately for black, it's white's turn to move, and he will win this race. So they both advance, racing to become queens. But white is one step ahead, and as a result, whatever black tries, white can simply slide in and capture the pawn on the next move. Let's say he does go for the queen, and now, because it's white's turn to move, because he's one step ahead, he gets the queen, and now he can go on to mate the black king. So if we go back to this starting position, think about it for a second. We said that white has the opening move advantage, and if he's able to maintain that advantage, this is what the endgame would look like, or possible scenarios like this. Often there are more pawns and maybe a piece left on the board, but this race is very common in chess, and the side that has the initiative usually wins. In the first example, we saw how white used his time advantage to promote a pawn to a queen. In this example, we're going to look at how you can use your time advantage to win material, to win a pawn or a piece. Notice that in this position, both sides have the same types of material. 2 bishops, 2 knights, 2 pawns against 2 pawns. But notice that this pawn is attacked once by the white bishop. Now if white can maneuver and have a gang attack, which I call a gang attack in my book, he can win that pawn. And if you give a moment of thought, you can see that if the knight swings in, he can attack the pawn again. So unfortunately for black, it was white's turn to move, because had it been black's turn to move, he could spend a moment bringing his bishop here and then here to defend the pawn. So consequently, we have 2 against 1, and white will use his time advantage, because he's one step ahead, one move ahead, to win a pawn. White often uses his first move advantage to gaining an advantage in space, which we'll be looking at in the next lesson, strategic lesson on space. As you work through these examples, you'll see how one element can be converted to another element to gain an advantage. Like this last example, white used his advantage in time to actually convert to a force advantage by creating 2 against 1. Now proceed to the strategic lesson on space.